Imagine standing on the edge of the Southern Ocean, the kind of place where the wind doesn't feel like weather so much as a living force, where the horizon is a hard line of steel-grey water and white ice, and where you learn very quickly that Antarctica isn't cold the way winter is cold. Antarctica is cold the way space is cold. And if you make the mistake of leaning over the rail and looking down into that water, your brain will try to comfort you with familiar expectations: tiny fish, microscopic plankton, maybe the occasional jelly drifting like a plastic bag, because that's what most people picture when they think of the ocean. But the Antarctic doesn't reward comfort, it rewards respect, and what actually lives beneath that surface can feel like a biological prank with a dark sense of humor. Creatures that look like normal animals from warmer seas, except scaled up into something that seems wrong, in the same way a human hand would look wrong if it were the size of a car. In these waters, you can find sea spiders with legs spanning wider than a person's shoulders, starfish that look like they've been cloned and reassembled into a many-armed nightmare, crustaceans that resemble armored tanks, and jellyfish whose trailing tentacles can stretch out for distances that make whales look short by comparison. And the truly unsettling part is that none of this is mythology, none of it is ancient sea monster exaggeration. It's biology, and the engine behind it is something most people have never even heard of: polar gigantism, a real evolutionary pattern where many cold water invertebrates in polar regions become unusually large compared to their relatives in warmer oceans, as if the cold has turned the dial on body size and snapped it off at the maximum. And at first glance it makes no sense, because if you ask someone to design survival rules for the Antarctic, they would probably predict the opposite. When food is scarce and temperatures are brutal, smaller bodies should win, smaller bodies should need less energy, smaller bodies should mature faster and reproduce earlier, smaller bodies should be safer, and yet the Antarctic, in this strange inversion, has produced giants. And to understand why, you have to stop thinking of the ocean as water and start thinking of it as a physical environment, with rules that directly shape what bodies are allowed to exist. The Southern Ocean is not just cold, it is oxygen-rich, stable in temperature, and historically isolated by powerful currents. And for cold-blooded animals, creatures whose body temperatures are controlled by their environment and whose oxygen supply comes from the water, the Antarctic is a world that can quietly remove the usual biological brakes that keep bodies small. And once those brakes are gone, evolution doesn't need to invent new monsters, it only needs to scale up old blueprints. So let's begin with one of the most dramatic symbols of this entire phenomenon: the colossal squid, the heavyweight champion of squid mythology, and one of the largest invertebrates ever confirmed to exist, a creature that has been misfiled in the public imagination as a deep-sea oddity, when its true story is tied just as much to polar cold as it is to depth, because colossal squid are strongly associated with Antarctic waters, waters that hover at or below the freezing point of fresh water, yet remain liquid, because salt changes the rules and pushes the freezing point lower, creating an environment that is brutally cold but physically stable. And that stability is important, because stability allows slow strategies to work. In warmer, more variable seas, fast and flexible often wins, but in polar seas where conditions remain cold and consistent, a giant that moves efficiently and conserves heat can thrive. Now here's the first key that unlocks polar gigantism. Cold water holds more dissolved oxygen than warm water, and oxygen is not just nice to have, it is the currency of cellular life. Every living cell burns oxygen to make energy, and the bigger the body, the more oxygen it needs, not just for movement, but for basic survival. And in many environments, oxygen becomes the limiting factor that prevents animals from scaling up indefinitely. In warm waters, oxygen dissolves less readily, and as temperatures rise, oxygen availability can drop even further, which can put a ceiling on body size, especially for animals that rely on diffusion or relatively simple respiratory systems. But in the Antarctic, the water is cold enough to carry abundant oxygen, and that means the oxygen ceiling lifts, and once the ceiling lifts, creatures that would be too big to breathe in warmer seas can suddenly exist. And if you're an animal like a squid, an active predator with high demands, a body that grows quickly, a physiology that can exploit abundant oxygen, this matters. But oxygen alone doesn't explain why so many Antarctic Animals don't just get bigger, they get weirdly bigger, like evolution got stuck on the scale up command. And the second key is energy. In cold environments, metabolism tends to slow, chemical reactions run more slowly, and many cold-blooded animals can operate at a lower metabolic pace, meaning that for them, a larger body can actually become more efficient per unit mass. Bigger bodies lose heat more slowly, bigger bodies can store more energy, and bigger bodies can travel longer distances between meals. And in a world where food arrives in pulses, seasonal blooms, periodic feeding opportunities, a body that can store and coast can be a serious advantage. This is where the Antarctic becomes a paradox. It is cold and food can be patchy, but it is also oxygen-rich and historically stable, and those conditions can reward large, slow, tank-like designs. And if that still feels abstract, let's ground it in the most unsettling, simplest example: sea spiders, not true spiders, but marine arthropods called pycnogonids, which in many warm water ecosystems are small, often a couple of centimeters, creatures you could mistake for drifting debris, but in Antarctic waters they can reach sizes that look like they belong in a different era, with leg spans measured not in centimeters but in feet. And what makes that especially eerie is that their bodies are almost absurdly minimal: long spindly legs, a small central body, and a feeding apparatus that looks like a straw. Because sea spiders don't breathe the way many animals do, they rely heavily on diffusion, taking oxygen through their body surface. And in some species, oxygen exchange happens across the legs themselves, meaning that their bizarre geometry isn't just appearance, it's a respiratory structure. And in cold, oxygen-rich water, that leg-based breathing system can support much larger dimensions than it could in warmer, oxygen-poorer seas, and size changes everything. A tiny sea spider is easy to ignore, but a giant sea spider is suddenly a predator. You can imagine watching you, creeping across the sea floor on stilt-like limbs, stepping over sponges, corals, and starfish, with that slow, deliberate confidence that only very old ecosystems seem to allow. And when it feeds, it doesn't tear like a crab or crush like a lobster. It uses a proboscis, pierces soft-bodied prey, and draws out internal tissues in a way that is both efficient and deeply unsettling. Because it feels like a reminder that the ocean doesn't need teeth to be cruel, and the prey down there is not normal either, because polar gigantism doesn't just inflate one species, it can inflate entire communities, and that leads to scenes where even familiar animals appear transformed, like starfish, which in warm seas might live 5 years and carry 5 arms, like a simple symbol, but in Antarctic waters can live decades, grow larger, and in some cases develop far more arms, turning into many-armed predators that look like they've been upgraded, not just in size, but in complexity. And that matters because longevity changes ecology. A creature that lives 40 years can afford slow growth and slow strategies, and in a stable, cold environment, slow can be safer than fast. Now add in the gelatinous giants, because the Antarctic also hosts creatures whose size is measured not by weight but by length, like the lion's mane jellyfish, a species that can produce trailing tentacles so long that comparisons to whales stop sounding like exaggeration and start sounding like a measurement problem. Because if you stretch a tentacle linearly, you can reach insane lengths without needing the mass of a whale, and still, the fact that a jellyfish lineage can become so extended in cold waters points to the same theme. In the polar ocean, the constraints that normally keep bodies small or moderate are altered, and when constraints shift, life explores the space. But we have to be careful here, because if you hear cold makes giants, your mind might jump to polar bears or penguins, and you might assume this is the same rule, but it's not. The core mechanism of polar gigantism, as it's usually discussed, applies most strongly to cold-blooded marine animals whose oxygen comes from cold water and whose body temperature is environmentally controlled. And that is fundamentally different from warm-blooded animals, because warm-blooded creatures pay a constant energy tax. They have to burn fuel to stay warm, and in polar regions that tax becomes brutal. So while mammals and birds often do trend larger in colder climates, that's typically explained by a different principle. Larger bodies lose heat more slowly because they have less surface area relative to volume, which can be an advantage for heat retention, but it also increases the food requirement, and in the polar environment, food scarcity puts a hard limit on how huge a warm-blooded creature can become. In other words, the Antarctic can push cold-blooded animals into giant forms because oxygen and metabolic pace make large bodies feasible and sometimes efficient. But warm-blooded animals can't go full giant in the same way because they'd starve trying to fuel their own internal furnaces, and even among cold-blooded polar animals, gigantism isn't a universal destiny, it's a tendency with exceptions. And that's where the story becomes more interesting than a single rule, because there are cases where polar environments produce the opposite trend, polar dwarfism, where some fish lineages remain small or even become smaller, possibly because in extreme seasonal systems, a shorter life cycle and faster reproduction can be a survival advantage. And that tells you that evolution isn't following a moral narrative of bigger is better, it's following math. Whatever body plan maximizes survival and reproduction under local constraints is what persists. Now, to truly understand why the Antarctic can create giants, we need to zoom out and talk about the environmental physics that make this ocean different, because the Antarctic is not just cold, it is a giant boundary system for the planet, a ring of water cut off by currents, shaped by ice, and for long stretches of evolutionary time, it remained isolated enough that lineages could adapt into specialized roles without constant invasion from warm water competitors. And that isolation matters because competition can suppress extreme forms. If a warm water predator could easily migrate in, it might outcompete slow polar giants. But isolation creates a protected arena for specialization. Add the cold stability, and you get a world where the temperature doesn't swing wildly across seasons the way it does in many temperate ecosystems, and that stability can favor slow growth, long lifespans, and large bodies that would be too risky in places where conditions change rapidly. And oxygen, again, is the quiet fuel behind the whole thing. Cold water can carry more dissolved oxygen, and many invertebrates rely on diffusion or relatively simple circulatory systems. So oxygen availability can determine whether their tissues can be supplied. As bodies scale up in warm waters, diffusion distances become limiting, and oxygen availability can become a ceiling. But in cold, oxygen-rich waters, that ceiling lifts, and organisms can get away with larger dimensions, especially if they live slow and don't demand constant high-output bursts. And then there's the energy economy. In a cold environment, metabolic process is slow, and many ectotherms can run low power, which means their per-mass energy demands can be lower than you'd expect, making large bodies surprisingly economical, like a big, slow ship compared to a small, fast speedboat. This doesn't mean they never struggle for food, it means they can survive long gaps better. And when food does arrive, like seasonal pulses of productivity, it can be stored in a big body. Strategy that becomes more viable as body size increases. And yes, depth can join this story too, because deep-sea gigantism is a separate but sometimes overlapping phenomenon where certain deep-sea lineages become large, often linked to low temperatures, low predation, and food distribution patterns. And in the Antarctic, you can get a double influence in some regions, cold surface waters plus deep cold waters, which is why certain Antarctic-associated giants feel like they're the result of multiple forces pushing in the same direction, and the colossal squid is a perfect symbol of that overlap. Polar cold, deep habitat, abundant oxygen, fewer predators capable of challenging a heavyweight, and a body plan that can exploit ambush strategies in darkness. But even as we build this explanation, we should admit something uncomfortable. The Antarctic is one of the least accessible environments on Earth, and the deeper you go, the less we truly know, and that ignorance is part of why polar gigantism feels like a horror story, because a phenomenon that creates large, unfamiliar shapes in a place we rarely observe will always feel like the ocean is hiding a secret, and yet the most important truth might be that these giants are not designed to be scary, they are designed to be efficient in a particular set of conditions, and we interpret efficiency as creepiness when the design violates our expectations. A sea spider with legs like stilts and a straw-like feeding tube looks alien to us because we're primates who grew up in air, but to the Antarctic seafloor it's just a functioning machine, a successful strategy. Now there's one more layer that completes the puzzle: time. Because the Antarctic doesn't just change size, it changes tempo. Cold systems often slow life down, not just in metabolism but in growth and reproduction, and when generations take longer, evolutionary change can become slower in some ways, which means lineages can persist with relatively stable designs for long periods, creating ecosystems that feel ancient, where creatures can live decades and remain specialized for cold, stable conditions, almost like living relics. And that long stability is exactly what makes the Antarctic giants both magnificent and vulnerable. Because specialization is a bargain, you become perfectly suited for a stable world, but you become fragile if that stability breaks. And here's the modern twist that turns this from a cool biology, the story, into a warning. The conditions that enable polar gigantism, cold, oxygen-rich water, stable temperatures, historical isolation, are not guaranteed forever. And as the planet warms, ocean temperatures rise, and with warmer water comes lower oxygen capacity, and with lower oxygen comes a reinstated ceiling on body size. In other words, the same physics that allowed Antarctic giants to exist can reverse, and when it reverses, giant bodies become liabilities because large tissues require oxygen. And if oxygen availability drops, those tissues can't be sustained, and metabolic rates can rise, and suddenly a creature built for low-power cold life is forced into an environment that demands more energy while offering less oxygen, which is a lethal combination. This is why the study of body size isn't just trivia, it's a signal, because changes in maximum sizes across regions can act like ecological thermometers, hinting at shifts in oxygen and temperature that ripple through entire systems. And it's also why the Antarctic's monsters, as terrifying as they look in documentaries and photos, are not monsters in the moral sense. Most of them are not threats to humans, mostly because humans and these animals rarely meet under the conditions where the animals truly thrive, and because even the biggest among them are adapted to a world that is hostile to us. And the deeper truth is almost sad: these creatures are giants, not because the Antarctic is a magical monster factory, but because cold, stable, oxygen-rich water gives life room to grow in a way that warm oceans often deny. And if those cold conditions fade, the giants don't migrate to tropical paradise and become Hollywood sea monsters. They often simply lose their niche. So the Antarctic, for all its terror and mystery, is also a museum of alternative evolutionary outcomes, a glimpse of what life can become when the constraints shift, a place where oxygen and cold can lift the ceiling and allow familiar body plans to expand into forms that look like they escaped from an older Earth. And if you want the simplest summary of polar gigantism, it's this: cold water changes the rules of breathing, energy, and survival, and when the rules change, evolution explores the space, sometimes by shrinking, sometimes by slowing, but often, in the Antarctic oceans, by growing, by turning small things big and big things enormous, not for drama, not for horror, but because in that freezing world, size can be a solution. And maybe that's the final unsettling thought. We like to imagine the ocean as one consistent environment, but it isn't. It's a stack of different universes. And Antarctica is one of the strangest universes on the planet, a place where the cold doesn't kill life, it remoulders it, where oxygen-rich water lifts limits, where time slows, where stability allows giants to persist, and where the deep beneath the ice can feel like a biological echo of a world we weren't meant to see. And if you ever find yourself staring down into those black polar waters, remember, the scariest part isn't that monsters live there. The scariest part is that they're not monsters at all. They're just the logical outcome of physics and evolution. And the moment those polar rules change, the giants may be the first to disappear, not because they failed, but because the world that made them possible is slipping away. And if you want more videos like this, where nature's rules flip and create things that feel impossible, subscribe and tell me which extreme ecosystem we should dive into next. Disclaimer: this story is an educational narration based on established concepts in marine biology and ecology, and while the overall explanations are grounded in widely discussed scientific principles, exact sizes, lifespans, distributions, and mechanisms vary by species and ongoing research.